He didn't slow down. That was the thing nobody in the corridor would forget afterward. Not the woman with the toddler 3 benches down, not the public defender who stopped walking and then kept walking, not the man who stood up and then sat back down. What they remembered when they talked about it later was that Officer Marcus Webb didn't slow down at all. He just kept moving like she was furniture, like she was a problem in his path rather than a person with a right to be there. But that was later. First, there was the Tuesday morning itself, late August. The kind of day where the humidity arrives before you do, where the air presses against you the moment you step outside and follows you indoors, where the Monroe County Courthouse smelled of floor wax laid down in thick coats over 50 years of scuffed linoleum, of burnt coffee from a machine on the second floor that nobody had cleaned since the previous administration, and underneath all of that, something harder to name the specific human weight of people waiting to find out what was going to happen to them. It was a smell this corridor had been accumulating for decades. It lived in the wooden benches bolted to the walls, in the fluorescent lights that buzzed just slightly in the checkered linoleum that had been mopped 10,000 times without ever quite coming clean. Every bench was full. A woman near the far end was trying to keep a toddler from sliding off her lap while holding a folded court summons she kept checking and rechecking as though the details might have changed since the last time she looked. An old man in a suit that had fit him 20 years ago sat with his hands folded on his knees, staring at the floor with the particular concentration of someone trying to remember something important before the moment passed. 2 public defenders stood near the water fountain, speaking in low, urgent voices, their briefcases balanced against the wall, both already tired in the way of people whose tiredness has nothing to do with sleep. Along the right wall, traffic court overflow had pushed through from the adjacent hallway, and a long, ragged line of people stretched from the double doors all the way back toward the east entrance, their numbers clutched in their hands, their eyes moving between the display board and the clock above the clerk's window, with the arithmetic of people calculating whether they would make it to their next obligation. Nobody in this line had chosen to be here. That was the weight of it, the thing that pressed against every surface and every person involuntary presence, dressed up in process waiting to be told what comes next. This corridor on this Tuesday was about to become something else entirely. A stage. Not by design, not by announcement. Stages never announce themselves. They simply wait for the wrong person to walk onto them at the wrong moment and do the thing they have always done. Completely unaware that this time someone is watching with very different plans for how the scene ends. At the far east end, the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B opened with the particular self-important thud of a man who has never once considered opening a door quietly, and the day began its pivot. 17 years. That was how long Marcus Webb had been wearing the badge of the Grayfield Police Department, and in all of those 17 years, across every shift and every traffic stop and every courtroom testimony and every late night parked behind the billboard on Route 9, he had never not once been made to feel small while wearing it. This fact, this unbroken, unexamined 17-year fact, had done to him the thing that unchallenged comfort always does to a certain kind of man. It had made him absolute. He was 44 years old, not large in the way that intimidates through sheer mass, but broad through the chest and built with a forward lean, thumbs hooked in his utility belt. Jaw set in the resting expression of someone who has already decided how any situation is going to resolve before it begins. His boots were steel-toed and well-worn, but not well cared for, the leather creasing in ways that said he didn't spend time on polish because he didn't need to impress anyone below him, and in his world everyone was below him. His buzz cut had grown out unevenly at the sides, the uniform shirt pulled at the third button. He was either unaware of this or had decided not to care, which in practice amounted to the same thing. In the break room at Grayfield PD, the other officers called him old school. It was a polite phrase doing heavy lifting. On the streets of the East Side, the predominantly black neighborhood that made up roughly a third of Grayfield's geography and the vast majority of Webb's patrol hours, the residents had their own vocabulary for him, language sharpened by experience and passed from neighbor to neighbor. The way all useful information gets passed in communities that have learned they cannot rely on official channels. He had grown up in Grayfield, son of a mechanic who believed respect was something you established early and maintained aggressively, and who communicated this belief through a combination of loud certainty and a deep contempt for hesitation in any form. The son had inherited both. He had tried a construction management program at community college for a year and a half, quit during a dispute with an instructor he considered incompetent, and joined the Grayfield Police Department at 27, where he discovered with a relief so profound it felt like coming home that the badge conferred authority immediately and completely without the inconvenience of having to demonstrate why you deserved it. 23 official complaints in 17 years. Excessive force, unlawful detention, falsified arrest reports. Not a single one had resulted in disciplinary action. This was not an accident. This was a machine running exactly as it had been built to run. The head of internal affairs was Captain Roy Dawson. They played poker on alternate Fridays. This arrangement had proven over the years to be the most reliable form of professional insurance the city of Grayfield had to offer. This Tuesday morning, Webb had just stepped down from the witness stand in courtroom 3B. He had spent 40 minutes testifying in a drug possession case involving a young man from the East Side named Deshaun Pruitt, 22 years old, wrong place, wrong time, wrong zip code. And the testimony had been smooth and practiced the way testimony is smooth, when you've told the same kind of story 100 times and nobody with the power to question you ever has. The public defender had looked tired. The judge hadn't pushed back. Deshaun Pruitt would spend the next 18 months in county lockup for something Webb had manufactured on a slow Thursday in May. Webb felt good. He always felt good after the courthouse. It confirmed everything he believed about how the world worked and who ran it. He pushed through the oak doors, felt the crowd and the noise of the corridor as a personal imposition, and began moving toward the clerk's office at the far end with the stride of a man who has never had to navigate around other people, because other people have always moved for him. She was sitting on the edge of the third bench from the right wall, not sprawled, not taking up extra space. Exactly as much room as she was entitled to, feet tucked neatly against the wooden legs of the bench, back straight, without being rigid, occupying the corridor, with the specific quality of a person who has made a long study of how to exist in public spaces without apologizing for it. Dr. Claudette Marcus, 49 years old, ageless in the way of women who have never stopped moving towards something not restless, but purposeful. The purposefulness, so continuous and so deep, it had become a physical characteristic visible in the way she held her shoulders, in the economy of her movements, in the quality of her stillness, which was not passive. It was active. It was doing something. She wore a slate-gray wool coat over a dark burgundy turtleneck and precisely tailored charcoal slacks, elegant without performance. The wardrobe of someone who understood that understatement is its own form of authority. A large leather satchel rested against her right ankle, worn at the corners in the way of a bag that gets used rather than displayed. On her lap, a thick manila folder. She was reading it, not skimming, not pretending to read while thinking about something else. Reading with the full weight of her attention, the way people who have spent careers taking difficult documents seriously read. Difficult documents, every sentence processed before moving to the next. Her right hand held a pen. The pen moved occasionally in the margins. Small notations. Precise. Economical. The handwriting of a person for whom thinking and writing have become the same gesture. What she was reading, though, no one in the corridor could have known this was the operational budget and the internal affairs complaint log of the Grayfield Police Department. She had been studying it for 3 weeks, building from it a map of institutional rot more detailed and more damning than anything the department's own oversight structures had produced in a decade. Which was perhaps not surprising given that the department's oversight structures were part of what the map revealed. Around her, the human theater of the courthouse, the woman managing the toddler, the old man in the too big suit, the urgent whispers at the water fountain. Claudette was aware of all of it. She was distracted by none of it. She had learned over the course of a long career in large institutions to hold peripheral awareness as a background process while giving her full attention to whatever was in her hands. Her feet were tucked against the bench legs. Her feet were not in the aisle. The aisle was clear. She had 40 minutes before her appointment. The appointment she had not announced to anyone in this building because she had found over 20 years that unannounced arrivals produced more accurate data than announced ones. People perform for scheduled visits. They forget to perform when they don't know they're being observed. The pen paused. She had reached a page near the back of the complaint log. She had read it before. She came back to it because the pattern it documented was both specific and important, the kind of specificity that in a court of law makes the difference between a story and a case. One name appeared 7 times across 5 years of records, always the same categories, always the same geography, never a consequential outcome. She circled the name, slowly, deliberately. Not for the first time, but with the finality of someone committing to what the circle means. The name was Marcus Webb. She set the pen down, looked out at the corridor for one moment at all those tired, ordinary people waiting for things to be decided for them, and went back to reading. She didn't see the oak doors open at the far end. She heard the boots, though. And in the change of pressure in the corridor, in the barely perceptible shift of ambient attention that her peripheral awareness processed without requiring her to direct it, she felt that whoever had just walked in was walking in a particular way, the way of someone who had never considered walking differently. Webb saw her from 15 feet away. One glance. Less than a second. A black woman in a nice coat sitting on a bench directly in the path between him and the clerk's office. The conclusion was instantaneous. She was in his way. She had no obvious reason to be there. He was a police officer who needed to get somewhere. He didn't slow down, didn't consider walking around. Walking around would have required acknowledging that someone else's presence had altered his path. That was not a kind of acknowledgement Marcus Webb made. "Move it," he said, not looking at her, not breaking stride. Words delivered the way you deliver them to furniture. She looked up. The movement was unhurried. The pen capped itself with a small click. Her eyes moved from his badge first, always the badge, always the first piece of information, the thing that tells you what kind of conversation you're about to have, and then up to his face, taking him in with a measuring, unafraid steadiness that took Webb a half-second to register as unusual because it was unusual. People he addressed that way did not usually look at him like that. "Excuse me, officer," she said. Calm, steady, no apology in it. He stopped in front of her. He leaned in, not touching, but using his physical mass in the specific way of a man who understands that proximity is a form of pressure. That making yourself large in someone's space is a way of making them feel smaller. He told her this was a walkway, not a public library. Get her feet out of the aisle. Claudette looked down at her feet, looked back up. "My feet aren't in the aisle, officer. There's plenty of room to walk around." Something moved through Marcus Webb that he would have called anger, but that was underneath the anger, something more specific and more fragile. The sensation of being told a true thing by someone he had already decided didn't have that right. He looked around. A few people on the nearby benches had turned their heads, not looking directly in the careful, sideways manner of people watching something they are not sure they want to be seen watching. He registered the audience. His ego made its calculation. His voice dropped. Volume decreased. Temperature dropped further. The combination produced the specific quality of menace that doesn't need to shout, because its confidence in its own power is so complete that volume would be redundant. "People like you," he said, "always think the rules don't apply." Claudette's gaze hardened into something that Webb, had he been paying a different kind of attention, might have recognized. It was the expression of a person who is no longer merely observing a situation. She was documenting it. She told him she was waiting for her number to be called. She had a right to sit here. "Not anymore," Webb said. He stepped forward. He brought his right foot back. He drove the steel toe of his boot into the side of her shin with the full, deliberate weight of a man who has made a practice of this kind of certainty. The pain was immediate, specific. White-hot at the point of impact, spreading outward in concentric waves, the kind of pain that blooms and settles into a deep, nauseating throb that she already knew in the first half-second would be speaking to her in 3 weeks. Her body knew the difference between injury and accident. This was Eri. This was chosen. The satchel knocked sideways. The manila folder left her lap. Hundreds of pages, departmental budgets, audit reports, complaint records, 5 years of arrest logs, the page with one name circled 7 times scattered across the linoleum in a slow, terrible fan of white paper, sliding and overlapping and spreading across the dirty floor like something being spilled that cannot be called back. A woman on the next bench made a sound. Small, involuntary. A public defender stopped walking mid-stride, looked at the floor, looked at Webb, looked at Claudette, and then, after a moment long enough to be a decision rather than a reflex, looked at the floor again and kept moving. A man 2 benches down stood up, then sat back down. The sitting back down was also a decision. He made it with full awareness of what it meant. Nobody intervened. This was Grayfield. Marcus Webb was a known thing in it. Known things that have gone unchallenged for 17 years carry a weight that is very hard to act against in a fraction of a second in a public corridor when there is no one official to appeal to. Webb looked down at the scattered papers and made a sound that was technically laughter. "Look at that," he said. Cruel smile. "Now you have a reason to be on the floor. Pick up your garbage and learn some respect." Claudette did not scream. She did not cry. The pain was real. She let it be real. She had learned the difference between denying pain and managing it, and she was very good at managing it. She lowered herself carefully to the floor and began collecting the pages one by one with a patience that was not submission, but something harder and more purposeful than calm. She reached for a specific page, the one toward the back of the complaint log, the one with 7 circled entries, and as her fingers found it, she looked up, from the floor, at the man standing over her. "Your name and badge number," she said. The words were quiet, precise, carrying in them the complete compressed weight of everything she had been doing for 3 weeks and everything she intended to do beginning now. Webb looked down at her with the expression of a man who has just been offered a gift. He tapped the silver shield on his chest. "Officer Marcus Webb, badge 4419. He said it proudly. "File a complaint if you want, sweetheart. Tell them Webb sent you. Let me know how that works out." He stepped over her scattered papers. His boot came down on the page with his name circled 7 times, left a dark tread print across the ink. He walked away laughing, his stride unchanged, his certainty intact. Claudette watched him go. She collected the remaining pages with the same methodical care she had applied to the first, stacked them, squared the edges, returned them to the folder. She stood. She did not rub her shin, though the throb in it was steady and would be with her for weeks. She looked down the corridor once at the place where Webb had disappeared into the crowd. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out her phone. The call connected on the second ring. Mayor Gerald Ashworth's voice came through with the warmth of a man who had been waiting for a specific call for a long time and was deeply relieved it had arrived. He asked if she was in town, ready for the big announcement at the precinct this afternoon. "I am," she said. "I've learned more about this department's culture this morning than I expected to before the 2 o'clock briefing. I'll be making some immediate personnel decisions. The details can wait until after the ceremony." She said it in the measured tone that told him the situation was in hand, without telling him what the situation was. Then she thanked him and ended the call before he could ask follow-up questions. She stood in the corridor for a moment. She pressed 2 fingers against her shin through the fabric of her slacks, long enough to confirm what she already knew. The bruise was forming. The boot had been serious, not impulsive, chosen. She took her hand away. She looked one last time down the corridor toward the clerk's office. Then she picked up her satchel, walked toward the exit, and stepped out into the bright, indifferent August morning. She had work to do. She had always been very good at work. The Grayfield Police Department's central precinct was a 3-story brutalist concrete structure on Meridian Avenue that had been built in 1974 with the specific aesthetic philosophy of an institution that did not want to invite the public inside, and had succeeded so completely that 50 years later the building still communicated through unbroken gray concrete and windows placed too high for comfortable eye contact that whatever happened behind these walls was police business and not yours. At 2 in the afternoon, the locker room was running at full shift change volume. Lockers slamming, radios crackling, the ambient smell of men who'd been outside in August heat and considered personal fragrance broadly optional. Marcus Webb was holding court. He sat on the long wooden bench in the center of the room, boots unlaced, surrounded by 3 officers who orbited him the way younger animals orbit the dominant one, closest. Tyler Brannigan, 24, 6 months out of the academy, desperate for approval and deeply uncomfortable with half of what he witnessed daily, but too new and too afraid to say so. His laugh always came a half-beat late. Against the far lockers, Dale Stuckey, 38, a man of no particular convictions who had outsourced his judgment to Webb years ago and found the arrangement restful. And near the door, Pete Morrow, 42, who talked less than the others and watched more, watching now with a quality that was not indifference. Webb told the story of the courthouse. In the telling, already the 5th or 6th version in his head, though the first one aloud, the woman had been sprawled across the bench, feet out into the walkway, barely glancing up when he spoke to her. She had given him attitude from the first word. She had grabbed at his arm when he told her to move. He had simply relocated her, gently, professionally. And then she had knocked her own papers over in her dramatic overreaction. The truth of the steel-toed boot, the deliberate weight behind it. The page with his name landing under his tread, he had already done the work of making that unavailable to himself. People who do things they know are wrong, but have never been held accountable for them, develop this capacity. It comes with practice. Brannigan asked if it was risky. What if she filed a complaint? The question touched something briefly raw. Webb had run this calculation on the walk from the courthouse. He had the answer, but having the question asked aloud gave it an uncomfortable weight. His response was explosive, theatrical, designed to bury the question under volume. "Captain Roy Dawson runs internal affairs," he said, slamming his locker for emphasis. "We play poker every other Friday. Nothing sticks to me, kid. Not in 17 years. Not ever." He paused. "Let it land. We run this city. We are the law. The public doesn't own us. We own this city." The intercom cut through the last syllable. "All personnel mandatory assembly. 2:15 p.m. main briefing room. Introduction of the new chief of police." Webb's eye roll was theatrical. The slow, uniform adjustment in the mirror, the resigned sigh of a man who has outlasted several chiefs and expects to outlast several more. To him, leadership transitions were weather, not earthquakes. Weather passes, but underneath the performance something shifted. He didn't know who the new chief was. The mayor's office had kept it genuinely tight, and the information vacuum had bothered him more than he'd admitted even to himself. Webb's sense of safety was built on knowing the landscape. An unknown variable at the center of his landscape was something his certainty hadn't had to manage before. He checked his reflection one last time, satisfied with what he saw. He headed for the briefing room. To understand what was about to happen in that briefing room, you need to understand what the Grayfield Police Department had become and why it had taken this long for anything to change. 6 months earlier, the previous chief, Alan Whitmore, 22 years on the force, risen through ranks that rewarded loyalty to the institution over loyalty to the people it served, had been placed on administrative leave. The federal investigation that preceded this confirmed what the residents of Grayfield's East Side had been documenting for years in complaint forms that went into drawers that the department's arrest practices in that neighborhood were not responsive to actual crime patterns, but to internal incentives that rewarded high numbers, regardless of the legitimacy of the arrests, that the excessive force complaint process was functionally inaccessible to the people most likely to need it, and that several officers showed income streams their department salaries couldn't explain. Whitmore had retired rather than face the full weight of the inquiry. With his pension intact, he moved to Florida. The city was left with an institution everyone agreed needed to change, and nobody who had been running it was prepared to change. Mayor Gerald Ashworth had spent the 6 months since trying to find someone who could do what he had promised. Someone with real credentials and real field experience, and crucially, someone who could not be dismissed as naive by the people who most needed to be held accountable. The search kept returning to one name. The machinery that had protected Marcus Webb for 17 years was not a single thing. It was a web of arrangements, some formal, some barely conscious, that connected the right people and insulated them from scrutiny. Captain Roy Dawson was the most visible node. Heavy-set, expensive chair, perpetually loosened tie. The comfortable posture of a man who has never been held accountable for anything. He had built his career on being the person you called when you needed something to disappear, and he had made himself so indispensable to so many people that his position had become essentially unassailable. The arrangement between Dawson and Webb was simple. Webb produced arrests that made the department's numbers look productive. Dawson ensured the complaints those arrests generated went into a folder that was then put in a drawer. Everyone who needed to remain comfortable remained comfortable. For 17 years, the machine had run without a single gear slipping. It was still running when Claudette Marcus walked into the Monroe County Courthouse with her leather satchel and her manila folder and her pen, moving in precise, economical strokes across the margins of the complaint log. It would stop running very soon. Neither Webb nor Dawson knew that yet. The briefing room held 130 people at capacity, folding chairs in neat rows, the city's flag on the left, the department's flag on the right. A microphone that had been tested twice and was producing acceptable sound. Marcus Webb took the second row, close enough to look engaged, far enough back to exchange glances without being caught. He crossed his arms as he sat down, already bored. Mayor Ashworth took the podium with real gravity, the weight of a man who understood that what he was doing this afternoon had real consequences, which gave his demeanor a quality of genuine seriousness that separated it from the usual political performance. He spoke about the department's last year, named the problems without naming the people, talked about what he intended to do now. Webb's internal commentary ran without interruption. Another speech, another outsider, another round of sensitivity training dressed up as leadership. He'd outlasted 4 chiefs. He'd outlast this one. He caught Dawson's eye in the third row. They exchanged a glance, the usual shorthand. The mayor turned toward the side doors. "It is my profound honor," Ashworth said, "to introduce your new chief of police, Dr. Claudette Marcus." The room stood. Collective automatic the ceremony of it. Webb stood with everyone else, already composing his polite applause face, already thinking about what he was doing after this. A woman walked out from the shadow of the side corridor and stepped up to the podium. Dark navy uniform, pressed to a razor edge, 4 silver stars on the collar, a gold shield over the heart. Posture that said this uniform was not an outfit, it was an expression of something that had been true for a long time. Webb's brain processed the image the way brains process new information quickly, confidently mapping it against existing categories. New chief, woman, black woman, Chicago PD, 20 years, law degree, master's degree. And then his brain reached the face, the jawline. The dark measuring eyes moving steadily across the room, in a deliberate scan past the back rows, past the lieutenants, past the detectives. His brain refused the information for 2 full heartbeats, because accepting it would require the entire architecture of his certainty to come down. And certainty fights very hard to stay standing. But it couldn't fight the face. It was exactly the same face. The slate-gray coat was gone. The manila folder was gone. But the face was the same. The eyes were the same. And they had found him now. He was in the second row, exactly where he always sat, exactly where it was easiest to find him, and they held him there. 3 seconds. 3 agonizing seconds. Her expression contained no rage, no triumph, no satisfaction, none of the things he might have known how to respond to. It was something else entirely. The absolute settled calm of someone who has already completely decided what is going to happen next and is making sure before it begins that you understand you cannot stop it. She stepped to the microphone. She didn't look at her notes. She spoke, and the tone of her voice was the exact tone she had used in a courthouse corridor when she asked a man to give her his name and badge number. "My name is Claudette Marcus. And as of this exact moment, everything you thought you knew about how this department operates is over." Webb sat back down. His legs were doing their best under difficult circumstances. The cold sweat on his forehead was a new thing. His certainty, which had been absolute for 17 years, had just developed a crack. Not small at all. Webb waited until the last officers filed out. He was alone in the briefing room for several minutes, sitting in a chair full of folding metal and the residual weight of things that could not be taken back. He took the back stairs to the 3rd floor. He was aware of cameras in a way he had never been before. Not afraid of them, not exactly, but aware. He had spent 17 years not thinking about cameras because cameras were things other people had to worry about. Dawson looked up when Webb came through the door without knocking. Irritation first. Then, as he read something in Webb's face that was very different from the usual walk-in energy, something more careful, Webb closed the blinds on the glass wall. That was when Dawson understood this conversation was going to be something specific. The confession came in pieces. Not strategy, just the genuine difficulty of saying things aloud that had been more manageable as thoughts. There was a woman at the courthouse. A bench. She was in the way. He told her to move. She gave him attitude. He moved her. With his boot. And she asked for his badge number. And he gave it to her. And told her to file a complaint. Dawson's face moved through its sequence. Irritation. Confusion. Realization. Horror. Then a pale, sick gray, the color of a man who has just understood that the machine he operates has for the first time produced a consequence he cannot simply redirect. He summarized it in the flattest language he could find. "You kicked the new chief of police." On her first day in the city, Webb's plea was immediate. Could Dawson intercept it, bury it, do what he always did? This was just another complaint, just another. But Dawson wasn't listening to the plea. He was calculating. And the calculation was not about Webb. It was about himself, his own exposure, his own safety, the specific and personal cost of Webb's panic or arrest. He came to a conclusion. shared it in the measured tones of a man dispensing strategy dressed as friendship. Keep your head completely down. Everything by the book. No shakedowns, no friction with anyone above your rank. If she filed a formal complaint, it had to come to Dawson's desk first. That was where his control lived, and inside that control, the complaint could be buried in administrative review for months. Neither of them said what existed in the silence between their words. She had found Webb in that assembly room, in a room of 130 people. She had looked at him for 3 seconds, and the look had contained no uncertainty at all. People who are about to bury complaints don't look like that. Webb left carrying Dawson's strategy like a life raft, gripping it with both hands because it was what he had. Dawson sat alone after the door clicked shut. He opened his desk drawer, looked at something inside, closed it. When he took his hands off the desk, they were not entirely steady. Top floor, chief's office, door locked. Claudette sat behind the mahogany desk that still smelled faintly of the previous occupant, some cedar-adjacent aftershave, the ghost of an administration she was here to replace, and she rolled up the right leg of her uniform trousers. The bruise was fully formed, dark purple at the center, spreading at the edges into a yellowed red, the size of a plum. Just below the knee on the outer shin, a location that would make stairs uncomfortable for a week, and crossing her legs painful for 2. She looked at it for a long moment. Let it be what it was. Not metaphor, not symbol, just fact. A man had driven his boot into her leg with deliberate force because she had declined to apologize for occupying space she was entitled to occupy. The body's language was clear. This was serious. This was chosen. The thinking that followed was not angry. Anger was present somewhere beneath it, cold, continuous, exerting pressure, but the thinking itself was analytical. If she arrested Webb today, Dawson would classify it as a personnel matter immediately. The union would file for emergency injunctive relief. Webb would be placed on paid leave, not suspended. Back on patrol in 90 days with back pay. The machine would reveal every one of its defensive mechanisms before she had built anything capable of defeating them. One bad cop, and a damaged relationship with every officer in the building before she had been on the job for 24 hours. What she wanted was not one bad cop. She wanted the machine. 17 years of buried complaints. Every business owner in the East Side who had been paying a monthly tax to Marcus Webb because they were more afraid of the tax collector than hopeful about the complaint process. The entire architecture of it named, documented, placed in front of a federal judge. She rolled her pant leg down, smoothed the fabric, pressed the intercom. "Send up Detective Simone Carter, please. Tell her not to knock. Just come in. Patience is not weakness. Patience is loading the weapon slowly enough that you never miss." Simone Carter came through the door with the specific wariness of a person who has spent several years being summoned by authority for purposes that rarely benefited her. She carried it lightly, walked quickly, and directly sat when she was gestured toward the chair without hesitation. But it was visible if you knew where to look in the slight tightening around her eyes when the door closed and they were alone. 37 years old, compact, the efficient posture of a runner, hair pulled back in a knot that was purely functional, dark slacks, dark blazer, sensible shoes, everything chosen for durability and mobility rather than impression. Her hands folded in her lap as she sat were completely still. The file Claudette had read twice before arriving in Grayfield told a specific story, not the official narrative beneath that in the patterns the official language tried to smooth over. Highest homicide closure rate in the precinct, 4 consecutive years. Working cases that were routinely more complex and less resourced than those assigned to her peers. Results that in any functional institution would have produced at least 2 promotions. She had been passed over 3 times. The reason 3 years ago she had responded to a call about an erratic driver on Route 9. The driver was an off-duty Grayfield officer. 9 drinks past the legal limit. He told her who he was and asked her to call him a car. She called him a car, a police transport car, filed the DUI report, pressed the charge. The officer was convicted on a plea. 30 days community service, kept his badge. Simone Carter had been assigned cold cases and records review ever since. Because she had refused to extend the professional courtesy of pretending that driving drunk at twice the legal limit was not driving drunk. She was black. In a department that looked like Grayfield's, this was not irrelevant. Claudette asked her directly why she had been passed over 3 times. Simone deflected something about the promotion board, the process. "I don't need to ask the promotion board," Claudette said. "I know why. The DUI arrest, the conviction, the 3 years of punishment that followed." She named each detail specifically, watched Simone's face as each one confirmed what she already knew was true. Watched the jaw tighten, the eyes go still. Simone didn't deny it. "I did my job," she said. "I need you to do it again." Claudette leaned forward. She laid out the framework in broad strokes, a quiet investigation off the books. No official channels, nothing visible to the people who had the most to lose from it. Focused on a pattern of excessive force extortion and civil rights abuses in the East Side. The center of that pattern, the name appearing most frequently and most damagingly, was Officer Marcus Webb. Simone's reaction was practical, immediate. Webb is protected. Dawson is his shield. Any investigation touching Webb goes through internal affairs. Dawson buries it before it produces anything usable. This one won't go through internal affairs. She laid out the structure: direct federal coordination warrants signed by federal magistrates rather than local judges who moved in Dawson's orbit, evidence secured in ways that bypassed the precinct's evidence room entirely. 5 years of Webb's arrest reports, cross-referenced against hospital admission records, names of every business in his patrol territory, pattern documentation that a federal prosecutor could use. Simone said quietly, without drama, "If they find out what I'm doing, they will try to ruin me completely. I've already lost 3 years of my career." Claudette stood and walked to the window. The East Side visible in the middle distance, its streets and its people and its long expensive experience of a system that protected certain people from certain consequences. She turned back. She told Simone what had happened in the Monroe County courthouse that morning, without embellishment, without the language of victim or complaint. Just the facts, the bench, the boot, the bruise, the badge number delivered with pride. Simone's reaction broke through her professional composure for exactly 1 second. Her hand moved toward her mouth and stopped. "You can arrest him right now," she said. "Tonight. If I arrest him tonight, I get 1 bad cop and a department that closes around him like a wound." Claudette held her gaze. "If we do this right, we get all of it. The whole machine. Everything it's been protecting." She paused. "Are you in a moment of real calculation, real decision? Not long, but real?" Simone squared her shoulders. "I'm in." Those 14 days passed differently for the 2 people at the center of what was being built inside them. For Marcus Webb, the first 3 days were genuine terror. The quiet, pervasive kind, not dramatic fear, but grinding, sleepless dread. He checked his locker 3 times every shift for a pink slip. He flinched when his radio produced his name in a call. He avoided the top floor of the precinct with a care that looked to anyone watching like ordinary territorial distance between patrol and command. It was not ordinary. Days 4 through 7, Dawson's reassurances began doing their work. She was in budget meetings, city council hearings, press conferences, the consuming machinery of a new executive's first weeks. A complaint about a hallway incident was not anyone's priority while the department was under federal scrutiny and the mayor was trying to demonstrate meaningful reform. Webb heard this, told himself he believed it. Days 8 through 12, the arrogance began its return. Slow at first, like a tide coming back in. She hadn't called him in. She hadn't suspended him. The machine was doing what machines do, absorbing pressure and protecting its components. He was a component. He was protected. Days 13 and 14 at the poker game on the second Friday. Dawson was expansive and confident she was learning what all the outsiders learned, that the streets of Grayfield weren't governed from the briefing rooms, that the real work was done by people who knew the territory and the players and the unofficial systems that kept everything functional. By the last evening before Wednesday, Webb sat in his car in the precinct parking lot before his shift and told himself clearly and with conviction that the new chief was figuring out the same thing every outsider figured out eventually. She needed him more than she could afford to use him against himself. Meanwhile, in a records room on the second floor in an FBI field office satellite location across the city, and in a back office of a small auto shop on Industrial Row, Simone Carter was building something in the dark, pulling files by hand, no digital trail, cross-referencing arrest reports against hospital admission records with the focused patience of someone who has spent 4 years closing cases everyone else gave up on. She understood that the most important evidence is usually the kind that requires the most work to find. The folder got thicker every day. It was almost ready. Industrial Row was a stretch of Grayfield that the city's development plans kept describing as under revitalization, a phrase that had appeared in 6 consecutive annual reports without producing any visible change in the actual condition of the street. Motor shops, small fabrication operations, a metal recycling yard, a discount warehouse. It smelled of motor oil and hot asphalt and dried paint, and in the hour before sunset, the low light did for Industrial Row. What low light does for things built for function rather than appearance, it revealed the integrity of their structure beneath the wear of their surfaces. Beaumont's Motor Works occupied a double lot at the corner of Industrial Row and 5th Street. Distinguished from its neighbors by a hand-lettered sign above the bay doors painted by Arthur Beaumont himself in 1998, and touched up every 3 years since and by a quality of order that the neighboring properties did not share. The lot was swept, the tools were organized, the cars in the yard were tagged and tracked and waiting for legitimate work. Arthur Beaumont, 52 years old, had built this place from a single hydraulic lift and a set of second-hand tools bought at an estate sale. He had built it honestly, which in the east side of Grayfield represented a specific and hard-won kind of stubbornness. His wife Nadine worked the front desk 3 days a week, handling the bookkeeping and customer calls with calm efficiency. Their daughter Kezia was 19. She was starting a nursing program in the spring, accepted to the hospital system's direct training track, which was competitive and required a deposit that Arthur had been saving toward for 4 years. Putting money aside every month in a separate account with the discipline of a man who had decided this was the most important thing in his financial life and had organized everything else around it. The account was almost there. Or it would have been if 3 years ago Marcus Webb had not discovered the shop's cash-heavy operation and begun drawing from it indirectly every month in the form of a protection payment that Arthur made in an unmarked envelope. Because the alternative, the zoning inspectors, the inventory audits, the resisting arrest charges that would stick because they always stuck, was worse than the payment. 3 years, $500 a month, $18,000. From Keziah's future. Arthur had never told Nadine. Telling Nadine would have required explaining why. And explaining why would have required admitting that the system meant to protect them was the system extracting from them. There are things a man carries alone rather than make his family carry with him. On Tuesday evening at 6:30, the sound of gravel came from the back of the lot where Arthur hadn't expected any vehicle, and he knew without looking what it was. Webb and Brannigan came through the back gate. Always the back, out of sight of the street cameras, out of sight of witnesses. Webb ordered Brannigan to kill his body camera. Technical malfunction, he said. Bored, routine, a man for whom this instruction was part of the ritual. Brannigan hesitated. The new policy from Chief Hastings, the chief, was very clear about turn it off, rookie. No heat in it, just certainty, unless you want me to write you up for insubordination. A pause that lasted slightly longer than usual. Then Brannigan complied. The conversation that followed was quiet. These conversations always were. Quiet voices carry more menace than loud ones in a closed space, and Webb had spent 17 years learning the techniques of power without needing to articulate them. He walked the floor, commented on the inventory, made the same observations about catalytic converters and zoning regulations he had made on previous visits with the fresh casualness of a man who doesn't need to vary his material because the audience never changes. Arthur said he didn't have the envelope. Business had been slow. The mortgage was due. Fast. Without escalation. The hallmark of practiced cruelty. It doesn't need to build to its worst version because its worst version is always available. Webb grabbed the front of Arthur's overalls and moved him against the truck with enough force to produce a sound from Arthur's back that was somewhere between surprise and pain. "The tax is due tomorrow night," Webb whispered. Face inches from Arthur's, completely calm. "You don't have it, you get a resisting arrest charge. And it will stick. It always sticks." "Are we clear?" He let go, smoothed his uniform shirt, walked back to the cruiser. He felt restored, powerful. The new chief hadn't changed a thing. Oakage was still his. He climbed into the car completely oblivious to the fact that his entire career had just ended. He simply hadn't been told yet. The back office of Beaumont's Motorworks, blinds drawn, 2 people in the dark bathed in the blue glow of surveillance monitors. Detective Simone Carter. Beside her, a technician from the FBI's regional field office, no name needed, just a presence with a laptop and a federal clearance badge running checks on equipment that had been installed in this room 6 days ago with Arthur Beaumont's quiet, frightened, grateful cooperation. The monitors showed 2 feeds simultaneously. The overhead angle from the smoke detector above the garage floor resolution high enough to read the labels on the parts boxes in the corner of the frame. The audio waveform from the directional microphone concealed in a stack of tire boxes near the lift, the waveform dancing with each word of Webb's whispered threat in a way that made the words visible before you even heard them. Every moment of the encounter was there. The arrival through the back gate, the instruction to Brannigan to deactivate his body camera, the compliance, the physical contact with Arthur, the exact words of the threat, the specific amount demanded, the timeline for payment, a simple case, irrefutable documentation. And in federal court, simple cases with irrefutable documentation tend to resolve in a particular direction. Simone pressed the radio. "Chief Marcus, we have it. Clear audio and video. Extortion, assault, premeditation, and tampering with department equipment. He made the rookie kill his camera." Miles away on the top floor of the precinct, Claudette received the call standing at her window. The city of Grayfield spread out below her, the east side visible in the middle distance, its lights and its streets and its long, patient, expensive experience of people who had been waiting for something to change. She gave her instructions in a quiet, precise voice encrypted drive, not the precinct evidence room, directly to her house that night. No digital log. No official channels until she said otherwise. Simone asked about Webb, about timing. Claudette looked at the lights for a long moment. "Let him sleep tonight," she said. "Let him think he won. Let him put the envelope in his basement and feel safe and go to sleep, believing the machine is still running." She paused. "Tomorrow morning we don't just spring the trap. We burn down the whole forest. The most frightening thing is not the fall. It's the moment you realize the ground was never where you thought it was." Webb arrived at 10 minutes to 8 holding a large iced coffee and wearing the expression of a man who has come through something difficult and confirmed on the other side of it that he was right about himself. 2 weeks of anxiety. Gone. Processed, reframed, filed as evidence of his own resilience. He was himself again. Good, ready, untouchable. His walk through the bullpen was expansive, theatrical, shoulder-slapping. Too loud laughter at something Stuckey said near the break room, The performance of ease, which wasn't technically a performance because Webb's natural state when he felt good about himself was theatrical expansive, taking up more room than the room required. He didn't notice the quality of the morning's tension. The administrative staff moving with a focused efficiency slightly different from their usual rhythm. Certain conversations stopping a fraction of a second earlier than they normally would. Pete Morrow, visible across the bullpen, watching him with the patient attention of a man who has been waiting to see something confirmed and is now watching it be confirmed. The envelope from Beaumont's garage was in the lockbox in his basement. Untraceable. Tax-free. Proof to himself that nothing had changed. At exactly 8 o'clock, the PA crackled. Not the dispatcher's voice. Simone Carter's. Captain Roy Dawson. Officer Marcus Webb. Officer Tyler Brannigan. Interrogation room. A. Immediately. This is not a request. Webb stopped walking. Coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He found Brannigan across the bullpen. All the color was gone from the kid's face. He looked like a man who had already accepted something Webb was still fighting. Webb crossed to him, told him it was probably the warehouse debrief from last week, his voice finding its normal register through what felt like minor physical effort. "Keep your mouth shut. Let me do the talking. Dawson will be there. We're golden." Then he began walking toward the interrogation wing. His hands were not shaking yet. He considered this a point of pride. Dawson was already in the hallway outside interrogation room A. Loosened tie standard, but the quality around his eyes was not standard. Something more cautious than usual, something that Webb had never seen on him before, and Webb chose to read this as general wariness about the new administration rather than anything specific. Dawson coached them anyway. Urgent whisper. Deny. Deflect. Demand union representation. He controlled the internal affairs docket. They couldn't discipline without his sign-off. She hadn't bypassed him yet and couldn't bypass him because nobody bypassed the head of internal affairs. That was the whole point of the head of internal affairs. The door was heavy and steel and opened inward. The room beyond it was wrong. Table pushed against the wall. Chairs gone. Standing room only. The configuration not of routine inquiry, but of confrontation. Everyone on the same floor. Nothing between them. The geometry of a room that has already decided how it ends. Chief Claudette Marcus stood in the center. Uniform immaculate. 4 silver stars. Gold shield. The posture of someone who does not need furniture to establish her position. To her right, Simone Carter holding a bound evidence package approximately 2 inches thick. To her left, a man in a charcoal suit with a badge clipped to his belt. Not a Grayfield badge. Special Agent Dominic Reyes, FBI Public Corruption Task Force. Mid-40s, dark-haired, built with an economy of movement that suggested someone who had made a long study of how to occupy a room without wasting anything. His face was not unkind, but was entirely without warmth. Dawson went on the offensive immediately. Puffed chest. Official language, protocol. You cannot bring federal agents here without notifying internal affairs. This is an internal affairs matter. He leads the inquiry. Claudette took 1 step toward him. You're mistaken about 2 things, Captain. First, this is no longer your precinct. She held his gaze. Second, this is not an internal affairs matter. This is a federal criminal investigation. Dawson. Sitting down. Webb tried to inject authority into his voice, demanded to know what was being investigated. His voice found most of its usual register. It cracked on the last word. Claudette turned to Simone. The flat-screen monitor on the wall hummed and came to life. The image, Beaumont's Motorworks. Overhead angle. 4K, full color. Date stamp the previous evening, 6:42 p.m. The audio kicked in crystal clear, captured by the hidden microphone, every consonant rendered. Webb's own voice filled the interrogation room. Turn it off, rookie. Unless you want me to write you up for insubordination. We're having a private conversation with a business owner. It's a technical malfunction. Got it. He heard every threat, every demand for the tax, Every word of what he'd said to Arthur Beaumont with his face inches away. He heard the sound of Arthur against the truck. He heard himself walking away, and he heard at the very end the small, satisfied sound he had made getting back into the cruiser. The monitor paused on his face, smiling. The face of a man who believed he was safe. The silence in the room had a physical quality. Webb found his legal counterattack. Illegal recording. Private property. No warrant. Fruit of the poisonous tree. Dawson grabbed onto it immediately. As head of internal affairs, he formally threw the evidence out. Agent Reyes reached into his suit pocket, produced a folded document, set it on the wall shelf with the flat, unhurried efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this cue. Title III Federal Wiretap Warrant, Reyes said. Authorized under the Hobbs Act for extortion under color of official right. Signed by a federal magistrate. It bypasses local courts. It bypasses local judges. He looked at Dawson. It bypasses you. Webb's back found the cinder block wall. He didn't remember choosing to move there. Claudette crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from him. Close enough that the height advantage he had over her produced nothing, because authority does not live in height, and her presence in this room carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical dimension. She spoke quietly, the tone of a surgeon. 2 weeks ago, you drove your boot into the leg of a black woman sitting quietly on a public bench because you decided in less than a second that she had no right to the space she was occupying, and because 17 years of experience told you that decisions like that carried no cost. Higgins couldn't look at her, his eyes fixed on her collar brass. You called her sweetheart. You gave her your badge number like it was a joke. You stepped over her papers and left a boot print on the page with your own name on it. She held the silence for exactly 1 beat. I let you believe for 2 weeks that the machine was protecting you. I let you come to work this morning feeling safe, not because I was afraid of the union, but because I didn't want just your badge. I wanted the whole machine. Every gear, every arrangement, every name. She turned to Brannigan, sharp, direct. No cruelty, just precision. She told him exactly what his exposure was. Hobbs Act extortion accessory, civil rights conspiracy, evidence tampering, federal mandatory minimums, 12 years minimum. You have exactly 1 opportunity to choose something different. Right now, in this room. Brannigan broke, not gradually, not with resistance, immediately, completely, with the gasping relief of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has been waiting without knowing it for permission to put it down. He had names, dates, a personal notebook in his locker with entries going back 8 months. He would give them everything. Dawson exploded, screaming at Brannigan, pointing at Claudette, demanding union representation, no knowledge of any financial arrangement. His authority as head of internal affairs made him immune to federal action. Agent Reyes stepped in front of him. Detective Carter also secured a warrant for your personal bank accounts. Reyes's voice was completely flat. The offshore LLC. The 20% cut of Webb's monthly collections routed through 3 intermediary accounts to a shell company registered in Delaware. He paused. Not a theory. A federal document with account numbers, transaction dates, and a forensic accountant's signature. Dawson's hand found the edge of the table. His knees didn't fold, but they came close. 2 federal agents appeared from the corridor. They were not rough, they were efficient. The handcuffs closed on Dawson's wrists with the sound of a mechanism designed to be permanent. His Miranda rights were read in the flat, professional voice of someone who reads them many times a week. He was walked out of the room. Webb watched the last wall between himself and consequence disappear through the door. He was entirely alone. Claudette faced him. The full weight of everything she had built in 2 weeks came to rest on this moment. Give me your weapon and your badge. His hands shook violently. He reached for the holster snap. The weapon came out and went on the shelf. Then, the badge, the shield he had worn every working day for 17 years, the thing that had organized his sense of himself and his place in the world, the permission slip he had been living under. It went next to the gun. Two objects on a shelf, and they looked exactly like what they were. Things that had belonged to him and no longer did. Simone Carter stepped forward with handcuffs. Webb turned because there was nothing else to do. The steel closed on his wrists, the same sound, the exact same mechanical precision that he had produced on 1,000 other wrists over 17 years. He understood now what the sound meant from this side of it. It was not what he had thought. "I gave 17 years to this city," he whispered. "All the venom gone. Just broken." Claudette stepped aside to let Simone lead him toward the door. "You took 17 years from this city," she said. "Today, we begin taking it back." They brought him through the main bullpen, not the service corridor, not the back stairs, not any of the routes by which things that are embarrassing are quietly moved through large institutions. Through the main bullpen, past the desks and the monitors and the filing cabinets and the break room doorway where the burnt coffee smell lived, past his colleagues. Dale Stuckey was at his desk staring at his monitor with the focused intensity of a man determined to have been looking at his monitor this entire time. He did not look up. Pete Morrow was also at his desk, but Morrow was not pretending to look at anything. He was watching with the patient, open attention he had always brought to things, and his face showed nothing that could be easily classified, though it was not nothing. It was the face of a man who has been waiting for a long time to see something confirmed. He was watching it be confirmed now. Officers who had been in the break room when the PA announcement came, who had laughed in the locker room 3 days ago when Webb told the courthouse story, stood at their desks or near them, navigating between two instincts. The blue wall reflex, the pull toward one of their own, and something else. Something that had no easy name in the culture of the Grayfield PD, but that several of them had been carrying quietly for several years, the sense that the thing they were watching happen was a thing that needed to happen, and that whatever discomfort they felt watching it was discomfort they had chosen by staying silent. Webb walked straight ahead. Nothing else to look at. The corridor felt longer than it had ever felt. The handcuffs behind his back changed the set of his shoulders into something he had never had to be in public before. Closed inward, facing the posture of restraint rather than authority. He felt this in his chest, in the exact place where his certainty had always lived, and what he felt there now was its absence, the most foreign thing he had ever experienced in his professional life. The front doors opened. The morning light came through, very bright, very indifferent. The August sun illuminating everything with complete democratic impartiality, making no distinction between what should be seen and what people would prefer to keep in the dark. The federal transport vehicle was at the curb, dark, utilitarian. Webb was helped into the back with the practiced efficiency of people who do this regularly and have stopped thinking of it as significant. To the person it is happening to, it is always significant. The door closed. The corridor of the Grayfield Police Department, the corridor Marcus Webb had walked for 17 years as its proprietor, existed now behind a wall of metal and glass. He did not look back. Claudette stood in the doorway of the interrogation room and watched the transport vehicle until it turned the corner at the end of the block. Then she stood there for another moment. Not triumph, not relief. Something more complex and more honest. The specific weight of a responsibility that has just gotten larger because dismantling the visible part of a problem is the beginning of the work, not its end. The work would be long, unglamorous, full of moments that didn't feel like progress even when they were. She reached down and pressed 2 fingers lightly against her right shin through the fabric of her uniform trousers. The bruise was still there. Still speaking. She let it speak. Then she reached for her radio. She asked Simone to arrange for a department liaison to contact Arthur Beaumont directly, not through official channels, but personally today, to tell him what had happened and to confirm the envelope he had been delivering for 3 years was the last one. The man who collected it was not coming back. What had been taken from him was being accounted for and would be addressed through the legal proceedings now underway. She wanted Arthur Beaumont to know before the end of this day that the machine had broken. Then she turned from the doorway and walked toward the elevator. She had a city to begin running. The United States District Court occupied a building that had learned different things from the decades than the Monroe County Courthouse had. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, polished mahogany surfaces, the federal seal behind the judge's bench, no flickering lights, no burnt coffee smell. The specific gravity of a room that does not host the hope that justice might be achieved here, but the assertion that it will be. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table in a gray suit that had been purchased for this occasion and not maintained well since. It hung off his shoulders in the way of clothes that fit a different man. He had lost weight, the kind that comes off not from effort, but from the metabolic cost of sustained fear over 8 months. His face without the uniform, and the certainty the uniform had always supplied, looked older, more uncertain. The trial had lasted 6 days and had been, from the prosecution's perspective, a construction project rather than a drama. Not surprise documentation. One piece of evidence on top of the previous piece, methodically the way Simone Carter had built it in the dark over 14 days, the federal warrant, the 4K footage, the audio, Brannigan's testimony, the bank records, the complaint files that Dawson had kept in a drawer for 17 years, the financial records tracing the offshore account back through 3 intermediary steps to Dawson's personal finances, and the testimony of 6 business owners from the East Side who had, in the month since the arrest in the presence of a federal investigator who was not Marcus Webb, finally described in detail and on the record what the past several years had cost them. In the gallery, the second row on the left held Arthur Beaumont and his wife Nadine. Their hands were interlocked on the wooden rail in front of them, her head resting very slightly on his shoulder. The quiet, undemonstrative posture of people who have been through something long and difficult and are sitting together at the end of it, wanting to see it conclude. Behind them, in the third row, sat Kezia Beaumont, 19 years old, who had started her nursing program in January. She was in the first year of the hospital system's direct training track. She was here today, watching carefully. She did not yet know the full story of how her tuition had arrived in the account her father transferred to the program 3 weeks after the arrest. That conversation was for after. This was after. Roy Dawson's trial had concluded 3 months earlier in a different courtroom. 12 years at a federal facility. He had requested transfer for safety reasons. The request had been granted. Tyler Brannigan was serving a reduced sentence 30 miles away, the result of the proffer agreement. The testimony, the notebook with 8 months of entries. He had cried through most of his testimony. Claudette Marcus sat in the second row. Not the front, not the back, leather satchel at her ankle, pen in hand, legal pad on her knee. Not in uniform, slate-gray wool coat, dark turtleneck tailored charcoal slacks. She looked like a woman attending a court proceeding with professional interest. She was the woman who had been on the floor of a courthouse corridor collecting scattered papers, while a man in a uniform stood over her laughing, who had gotten up and gone to work, and who was here now to watch the work conclude. Judge Harrison Bowman had been on the federal bench for 23 years. He had developed over those years the quality that the best judges develop, the ability to be both completely fair and completely clear, to hear everything that needs to be heard, and then to say without equivocation, without unnecessary language, what the law requires and what justice demands. He looked at Marcus Webb over his reading glasses. The courtroom was absolutely silent. In 23 years on this bench, Judge Bowman began his voice carrying without effort in the courtroom's precise acoustics. He had presided over violence, corruption, fraud, abuse of power, the full range of what human beings do to each other when they believe they can do it without consequence. But there was a specific category he found most serious. Not the most violent or the most financially damaging, though this one was both. It was the case in which the harm was committed by the very institution the harmed person had a right to expect protection from. The case in which the badge, which is a covenant, is used as a weapon against the people it was meant to shield. "You did not merely break the law, Mr. Webb," the judge said. "You broke an agreement. The fundamental agreement between the state and its citizens, the agreement that makes civil society possible, that says the person with the authority is constrained by that authority and not licensed by it." Webb stared at the table. He could not look at the gallery. He could not look at Arthur Beaumont sitting with his wife with their hands interlocked. And he absolutely could not look at Claudette Marcus in the second row. "You selected your victims with the specific intelligence of someone who understood which people would be least likely to be believed and least likely to have access to effective recourse. You built your operation in the places where the official complaint mechanisms were known to be weakest, where people had learned through experience that telling the truth about what had been done to them made their situation worse, not better." The judge looked at him steadily. This was not impulsive cruelty. It was practiced. It was planned. It had been running for 17 years. The sentence under federal sentencing guidelines for Hobbs Act extortion under color of official right, combined with civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, taking into account the duration, the pattern, and the 11 identified victims. 168 months. 14 years. No possibility of early release. Because the conduct in question was not a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a sustained, deliberate practice that continued until the evidence made continuation impossible. Furthermore, his municipal pension, the pension that represented 17 years of public service, was hereby stripped and liquidated. The funds to be divided among the 11 identified victims. The calculation for Arthur Beaumont's portion had been done with considerable care. The number arrived at was within $47 of the total extracted from Keziah's education account over 36 months. The gavel came down. Not dramatic, just final. The federal marshals moved. Webb was required to stand and turn toward the gallery before being led through the side door, standard procedure, the logistical sequence of things, and for approximately 4 seconds he was standing and facing the room. His eyes found Claudette Marcus. Not voluntarily. The eyes go where they go when everything else has been taken away. They go to the beginning, the moment where the sequence started, the person who had been on the floor collecting papers while he stood over her feeling powerful. She was looking at him. Her expression was not triumph. Triumph has a quality of surprise in it, a residual disbelief that the desired thing has actually arrived. There was no surprise in her face. This was exactly the conclusion she had been building toward from the moment she stood up from the courthouse floor and dusted off her slacks. No satisfaction either, not in the uncomplicated sense, because what she had wanted had never been the conviction of Marcus Webb specifically. What she had wanted was the east side of Grayfield to be able to go about its daily life without paying a tax to the man with the badge. That was a thing that would take years. It was not accomplished in a courtroom on a Thursday afternoon. What her face showed was acknowledgement, precise, weighted, honest. The acknowledgement of someone who has looked at a very large account and confirmed that this specific item has been settled. Who knows there are other items remaining? Who is prepared to address them in order? One slow nod. Not dramatic. Not performed. The slowness of something considered and deliberate, an action that meant what it was and nothing else. The debt incurred in the courthouse corridor had been accounted for. Placed in the permanent record of what happened and what followed. Not forgiven, not hers to forgive, and not the right word for this moment, but accounted for, completely. Then she closed her legal pad, clicked her pen, placed both in the leather satchel, stood. The side door opened. Webb was led through it. The door closed behind him. Claudette moved through the gallery and into the corridor and pushed through the exterior doors into the afternoon light, and as she came through, she took her phone from her coat pocket. A message from Simone Carter. 3 words Kezia got in. The nursing program's second-year advanced track. Competitive. She had applied 3 weeks ago. The phone went back in her pocket. She stood on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon sun for a moment. The light very clear, very direct, making no distinctions between anything, and then she walked toward the parking structure. She had a meeting in 40 minutes, a city to get back to. 1 week after the sentencing, the main briefing room of the Grayfield Police Department was full again. Same room, same floor, same fluorescent lights, same flags on either side of the podium. But the weight of the room was different. The way a room that has been forced to look at itself honestly feels different from a room that hasn't. Not lighter, not heavier, but more honest. The people in it felt this in the way they were standing and the way they were quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than 2 months ago. More honest, less defended. Claudette stood at the podium in her dress uniform. She was brief. Because the moment didn't need inflation, and because the people in this room were tired of long speeches from the front of it, and because the action she was here to take was self-explanatory in the best way. She said the department was no longer going to operate as a force separate from the community it was meant to serve. She said the relationship between the badge and the people who looked at the badge, whether with trust or with fear, and she acknowledged that for many people in Grayfield, particularly in the East Side, it had been fear for a very long time, was going to change through actions rather than announcements, through the quality of daily decisions made by every person in this room, through showing up differently every single day, until showing up differently was simply what they did. Then she announced the promotion of Detective Simone Carter to the rank of Lieutenant Effective, immediately with command of the newly restructured Internal Affairs Division, which would from this point forward have formal independence from the Chief's Office Civilian Oversight Representation on its review board and mandatory annual reporting to the Mayor's Office and the City Council. None of this had been true under Roy Dawson. The applause that followed was not the mandatory rhythmic applause of a room performing appreciation. It was the specific sound of people who have been holding something for a long time and are beginning carefully to set it down. Not everyone in the same way. Some people with genuine warmth, some with the complicated sound of a person who understands that applauding is also a commitment, that by applauding they are saying they are prepared to be the department this moment is announcing. Some near the front applauding because the people around them were applauding. This was fine too. Sometimes the commitment comes before the conviction. That is its own kind of progress. Simone Carter stepped forward and accepted her new rank with the nod of a woman who has been waiting for the right context to do her best work and who has found it and who intends to begin immediately. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Tuesday morning, late November, the humidity of August entirely gone. The air cold and clean and making no promises in either direction. Claudette walked through the glass doors of the Monroe County Courthouse for the first time since the morning 8 months ago, when she had been escorted out of its holding cell by a captain whose face had gone the color of raw dough. She was in uniform today, 4 silver stars catching the fluorescent light, gold shield over her heart, the leather satchel at her side, her stride the same stride it had always been, purposeful, unhurried, covering ground without the performance of covering ground. People in the corridor recognized her. The face had been on the front page of the Grayfield Tribune twice in the past month. The recognition showed in small ways, slight adjustments of posture, the particular attention people give to someone who has demonstrated they are there for a reason. She slowed as she passed the third bench from the right wall. The bench where she had been sitting 8 months ago with her manila folder and her pen and her feet tucked neatly against the bench legs, occupying exactly the space she was entitled to. The bench looked the same, wood worn in the same places, same bolted-in position, same spot in the corridor it had occupied since 1974. The corridor around it looked the same. Crowded, fluorescent lit, full of tired people, waiting for things to be decided. A young woman managing a toddler near the far end, an old man in a good suit looking uncertain. Two public defenders at the water fountain in an urgent conference that was probably the same urgent conference, just different facts. Every bench full. The weight of involuntary presence pressing against every surface, same as always. She didn't stop at the bench. She looked at it for the brief, full moment it deserved. Then she kept walking, because the bench was the past and the corridor was the present, and the present was where the work lived. 20 feet ahead, a young officer came down the corridor from the opposite direction, new enough to the job that his uniform still had the stiffness of an outfit rather than the softness of a second skin. He was moving quickly, arms full of files, head up alert. Ahead of him, a heavy-set man in a canvas jacket seated on a bench, one foot extended slightly into the walkway. Not significantly, not blocking it, but slightly the natural relaxation of someone who had been sitting for a while and let his posture ease below its starting point. Claudette paused. She watched. The young officer saw the foot. He adjusted his course without breaking his stride, a smooth, easy sidestep, the physical grammar of someone who moves around other people as a reflex rather than a concession. And as he passed, he said something brief accompanied by a small, genuine smile. Not performed, not obligatory, just, "You are a person in this hallway. I see you. You have not inconvenienced me. I hope your morning is going well." The man on the bench nodded once, the small nod of an acknowledgement that didn't need to be larger. Both of them continued, the officer with his files, the man to wherever the morning was taking him. The corridor absorbed the moment the way corridors absorb 1,000 such moments every day, without comment, without recording it. Claudette stood and breathed for a second. The department was not fixed. She knew this with more specificity than anyone, because fixing it was her daily work, and she was very clear-eyed about how much of it remained. The 11 names in the complaint file, the federal consent decree governing the department for the next 3 years, the community meetings that had started last month, where people from the east side sat across tables from officers and said things that had been waiting years to be said and listened to. The trust that would take a generation to fully rebuild if they did everything right, if they kept their commitments, if the daily decisions accumulated over years into something that looked different from what had come before. None of that was finished. None of it was close to finished. But in this corridor on this Tuesday morning, a man sat on a bench without tightening at the sight of a uniform approaching. And the uniform passed him and left him with his ordinary human dignity intact, unremarkable exactly as it should be. One corridor, one morning, one moment. Not enough. And also, not nothing. The first brick. And she knew better than most what you could build from first bricks, given enough time and enough people willing to keep laying them. She kept walking. That evening, on the top floor of the Grayfield Police Department's central precinct, Claudette Marcus sat behind the mahogany desk, the desk that no longer smelled of the previous occupant, because 8 months of her own presence had finally claimed the room as hers, and reached down out of habit, pressing 2 fingers against the outer side of her right shin through the fabric of her uniform trousers. Nothing. She pressed again. In the specific location where for 3 weeks the bruise had spoken to her in that steady, patient voice, where the steel-toed boot had done its deliberate work on a Tuesday morning in August. Nothing. Just shin. Unmarked. Unpainful. The body, having done what bodies do, addressed what could be addressed and moved on. The bruise was gone. Completely. Without ceremony. She sat with this for a moment, not with the dramatic quality of a person drawing meaning from an absence, but with the simple quality of a person noting a fact. The physical record of what had happened in the corridor had been metabolized and released, the way the body releases things when it is done with them. She took her hand away. What she thought about instead was the work on her desk, Not the sentencing, not the 14 years, not the nod she had given in the courtroom. Those were done, were in the permanent record, were accounted for. What she thought about was Arthur Beaumont's garage, and whether the city's legal department had moved on the commercial loss restitution calculation, which she had asked about twice, and which was moving at the pace that legal departments move, at a pace she was going to need to accelerate. She thought about the federal consent decree and the specific provisions she wanted internalized before the first review. She thought about Simone Carter's first month running the restructured division, which had been by any measurable standard a very good first month, and about what a good first month didn't guarantee, and what would need to be built to sustain it. She thought about Kezia Beaumont somewhere in the city tonight, in a nursing classroom, in a hospital corridor, in an apartment where she was studying, learning to do the work of caring for people who needed caring for, who did not yet know the full story of how her tuition had arrived. Who would be told when the time was right? Who would Claudette hoped be the kind of person who would take that story and do something with it, something larger than personal, the kind of thing that makes a story mean more than its own facts? She turned from the window. The desk was covered in documents, budget requests, departmental memos, a policy draft from the Civilian Oversight Board that needed her response by the end of the week, a stack of personnel files she had been reviewing as part of the ongoing process of understanding who in this department was capable of becoming something better than they had been allowed to be under the previous arrangement, and who needed to be moved toward a decision about whether they could. She sat down, picked up her pen. Outside, the city of Grayfield was going about its evening. The east side lit up with the ordinary light of people in their homes and their businesses going about the ordinary business of life, which was what the whole elaborate structure of justice was ultimately for. The ordinary, unremarkable, absolutely essential right of people to go about their lives without being afraid of the people who were supposed to protect them. The pen began to move, precise, economical. The handwriting of someone who has a great deal to do and intends to do all of it. She had a city to run. She was only just beginning. If this story stayed with you, if you saw in it something you've witnessed, something you've felt, or something you've been waiting a long time to see, get addressed, hit the like button, because it tells us to keep telling stories like this one. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what comes next, and ring the bell if you want to be first to know. Thank you for watching, and thank you for caring about the stories that matter.